This is the story of the David Bain case, which begins when David returns home after delivering newspapers. The first thing he does is go to the washing machine, put in a load of dirty clothes, and start it. Then, after freshening up, he enters his mother's room to see if she has woken up. Margaret is in bed with her face covered in blood. David runs to the living room where he also finds his father, dead next to a rifle. On the computer screen someone has written, "I'm sorry. You were the only one who deserved to live." It is Monday, June 20, 1994. The Dunedin Ambulance Centre in New Zealand receives the call at 7 o'clock in the morning. David Bain cries for help. He says they are all dead, that he has come home and they are all dead. "Who are all?" the operator asks. "My family," says David. "They are all dead. Hurry up." David is struggling to breathe, but he manages to give his address in whispers. At 7:20, the first police officers arrive at the house, which is on a huge plot and quite isolated from the neighbors. The house is old and looks dilapidated from the outside. The police analyze the situation before entering. They don't know if there is an assailant in the house. The house is silent, and through a window on the porch, they see David on the floor, at the foot of his bed. They knock on the door, but David makes no move to open it. He is in a fetal position. They believe he is in shock. They decide to break the glass of the door to open it from the inside. They approach David, who, crying, tells them they are all dead. The police officer asks how many people live in the house. "There are 6 of us," David responds. The house is in worse condition inside than outside. There is a great disorder caused by the apparent obsession with hoarding that all family members have. Clothes, for example, are not organized inside wardrobes and drawers. The wardrobes have half-hung doors and piles of clothes that start inside and continue over tables, beds, sofas, in addition to mountains of junk. There is dust everywhere. The house is built on a low level and has 2 floors. The upper floor is accessed through the main door, which is on the front porch of the house. To the left is David's room, where the eldest son of the family, 22 years old, has taken refuge. In front of David's room is the living room, which has a small office separated by curtains. And in front of the curtains lies Robin Bain, the 58-year-old father of the family. Behind the curtains on the computer screen, someone has written, "You are the only one who deserved to live." Robin has a gunshot wound to the head. Next to him is a .22 caliber rifle with the silencer mounted after David's room. To the left of the entrance are the stairs that go down to the other floor. Next to the stairs is Lynne's room, who is 18. She is in bed, covered with the duvet. She has 3 gunshot wounds to the head. On the other side of the hallway, there is another door. Margaret's room, who is 50 years of age. The mother also lies in her bed, under the duvet. She has a gunshot wound to the forehead, above the left eye. The next room is accessed from this one. It is the bedroom of the youngest in the family, Stephen, 14 years old. The police assume it is a dressing room and do not enter. Soon after, they find the 4th body. Aroha, 19, is in her room, just below David's. Aroha is on the floor. She was kneeling when she died. She must have heard what was happening upstairs and begged for her life. Her killer shot her in the forehead from the door. On the lower floor, there is also the kitchen and the laundry room. There are no bodies in these rooms. And David has said that there were 6 in the family, so 1 victim is missing. It is Stephen, who is in what they thought was the dressing room of Margaret's room. Yes, I say Margaret's because Robin does not sleep with her. Stephen lies on the floor of his room, which is as full of things and disorganized as the rest of the house. But despite that, the police officer is clear that there has been a struggle in the room. Stephen's killer did not catch him sleeping like Margaret and Lynn. Stephen fought back. There is blood in several spots on the carpet, but he also died from a gunshot to the head. During the struggle, he received another shot that went through his hand and grazed his head. David has a seizure when they find his younger brother's body. He convulses and eventually loses consciousness when the ambulances arrive. When they check the bodies to make sure no one is alive, they realize that Robin, the father, is much warmer than the rest. They believe that at least an hour has passed between the father's death and the other four. When he feels somewhat recovered, David asks for his glasses. They find them on an armchair in his room, but one lens is missing. They take his statement, and he explains that he went to do his newspaper delivery round with the dog and that upon returning home, he entered through the back door, which is in the kitchen on the lower floor, and started a load of laundry. After that, he went upstairs, freshened up, and entered his mother's room, where he found her dead. When he went to the living room, he found his father. The autopsies will confirm that all of them were shot with the same rifle owned by David, which he kept in his room. A key was needed because the rifle had a lock that blocked the trigger. The key was kept in a small box on the table in his room with some figurines on it. But Robin also has a large amount of ammunition for this rifle. Later, I will tell you more about the family and where Robin lives. They find Stephen's fingerprints on the rifle due to his position. It is clear that he left his fingerprints when he fought with his killer, held the rifle to push it away, and received a shot that went through his hand and injured his head. Stephen's autopsy also reveals that before the fatal shot, he was strangled with the shirt. When his attacker finally subdued him, he shot him dead in Stephen's room. Under the bed, there are white cotton gloves like those used by musicians and opera singers. They are soaked in blood. Additionally, in this room, but not in the first visual inspection, they will find the missing lens from David's glasses. They also find a bloody fingerprint on the washing machine. He didn't have blood on his hands, but he said that the first thing he did when he got home after delivering newspapers was to start a load of laundry. The police spread out and hanged the washed clothes in the garden to analyze them. They see that the clothes worn by the killer and the towels used to clean the blood are mixed with the rest of the family's clothes. And speaking of bloody footprints, when they study the scene under ultraviolet light after using a reagent, they see bloody barefoot footprints on the carpet. Although the chemical reaction lasts very little, they have time to measure them. They go from Margaret's room to the stairs and also see footprints at the entrance of Lynne's room. They are from a foot wearing a sock. It is one of the garments that are spread out in the garden. They have been washed with the rest of the clothes the killer was wearing. The socks belong to David, but to find out whose footprints they are, the measurements will have to be analyzed. Although at first, the case seemed quite clear, femicide with suicide, the police begin to have serious doubts about whether it was Robin, the father, or David, the surviving son. David stated that he arrived home at 6:42. A neighbor reported seeing David arrive home at 6:45 in the morning. She knows this because she had just gotten into her car to go to work. She looked at the clock, and it showed 6:50. She sets her clock 5 minutes ahead to avoid being late for work, so she is certain it was 6:45. David was carrying a large yellow bag, which he uses to deliver newspapers. The call to 111, New Zealand's emergency number, was made at 7 o'clock and 9 minutes, 25 minutes after David arrived home. David says he only took the clothes from the basket, put them in the washing machine, started it, and then went to wash his hands because they were black with newspaper ink. It doesn't take 25 minutes to do that, and David can't explain what he did with the rest of the time. Additionally, he declares he found Robin and Margaret but did not see his dead siblings. However, when he calls 111 and later, when he talks to the police before they start searching the house, he tells them they are all dead. How did he know? The police also discover that the bloody gloves belong to David. Robin's gloves are spotless among his clothes. If Robin were the killer, he must have changed clothes after killing his entire family to commit suicide afterwards. He only has his own blood on his clothes and body when he was found. What stands out in his autopsy is that his bladder was almost full. He woke up in the morning and, before going to the bathroom, killed his entire family, changed clothes, freshened up, and committed suicide. According to the first people who touched the bodies, an hour passed between the murders and his suicide, and he took great care not to leave traces. But he left his farewell written on the computer and did it without a single drop of blood. If there is one thing everyone who knows the Bain family agrees on, it is that they are strange. Robin and Margaret met at church and got married when Margaret was 25 and Robin was 33. Both were teachers. They had David, and a year later, they decided to go to Papua New Guinea because Robin's dream was to be a missionary. In Papua, Aroha, Lynn, and Stephen were born. At first, they lived in a very rural environment where they grew up wild. They didn't go to school, spent the day in nature, and never wore clean clothes. Margaret never showed any interest in maintaining minimal domestic hygiene. After Stephen's birth, they moved to a city where Robin continued to teach Christian religion. They had a hard time adapting to the organized life of a city because, among many other changes, this meant that the children had to start going to school. David was 12 years old in Papua. The couple began to have problems. It is said that Margaret became interested in the local culture. She participated in pagan rituals and believed in reincarnation. In the media, they talk about paganism, which means non-Christian, as if being interested in the culture of the place where you have gone to live is worse than going to that place to impose your religion or culture. After 15 years in Papua, when they only planned to stay for 3, the Bains, who were 3 when they left, returned to New Zealand as a family of 6. It was a drastic change. David started university, but he was expelled after the first semester. His grades were not good at all. The family's idea was to build a new sanctuary house on the large plot they had and wanted to be able to host groups of people and make it a kind of refuge. But they didn't have the money to do it. The couple's problems continued, and Robin was going through depression because he couldn't work. After having worked as a teacher in a very large international school and even having been a teacher trainer in Papua, in New Zealand he only found work as a teacher in a rural school a couple of hours from Dunedin, where he worked with another teacher. During the week, he slept in his van parked outside the school, and on weekends, he returned home but slept in a caravan. Although he was separated from Margaret, he continued to financially support the entire family and helped with house repairs. David, with his job as a newspaper delivery person, contributed to the family economy as well. After failing in his first university venture, David spent some time helping his mother tend the garden. They wanted to emulate the garden of Papua New Guinea. A couple of years later, he enrolled in a school to study classical music and joined an opera group where they gave singing lessons and prepared performances. At the time of the family's death, David had a girlfriend and was his mother's favorite child. He always was. Stephen, who was 9 years old when he arrived in New Zealand, was perfectly adapted to school, and Aroha was studying at the university. She wanted to be a teacher, like her parents. Of all the children, Lynn was the one who was doing the worst. A year before her death, she left the family home, was addicted to drugs, and engaged in prostitution. What the investigators found was that they were an unusual family with several problems. Lynn had told more than one person, but always to people with little connection or those she had just met, that her father and she had sexual relations. She defined it that way. She said that as a result of her father's rapes, she had a child in Papua New Guinea. In her diary, she also wrote it down, but it seems she didn't give excessive details about when it happened or what happened to the child, and no one can confirm it. However, of all the children, Lynn was the one who had the best relationship with her father. Lynn had left home and had an apartment where her father stayed when he separated from Margaret before finding a job. Of course, if he had been abusing her since she was a child, they would have a relationship of submission. And it might seem, in the eyes of others, that Lynn was the daughter he got along with best. On the other hand, some say that David had problems with his family, that the only person who tolerated him was his mother. There are witnesses who say that his 2 sisters were afraid of him and that he had threatened them with the rifle. Additionally, although it sounds a bit esoteric, Stephen, a couple of days before he died, told a friend that he had dreamed that David killed them with the rifle. David's girlfriend says that in the days leading up to the murders, David had strange episodes, as if he were in a trance. For example, it happened to him while watching a musical performance. Besides David, they also say he had macabre dreams. Apparently, David, half-jokingly, told a friend that he could use the newspaper delivery route as an alibi to commit a crime. He liked a neighbor and told his friend that he could deliver the newspapers before his usual time, go to rape his neighbor, and then leave the newspapers in the places where he knows he is always seen. Someone like that would seem to have done the complete route and could not be considered the rapist. The morning someone killed the Bain family, indeed, some saw David along his route, and no one noticed anything strange about him. It should be noted that both father and son could have a motive for the crime. David to inherit the land, which is enormous, and his father to hide alleged abuses against his daughter. Investigators try to reconstruct the scene according to both possibilities. The first is the most obvious. The killer is Robin, the father. After the family meeting on Sunday night, where Lynn says he has been raping her, Robin decides to eliminate his entire family when he enters the house. The next morning, David has already gone to deliver newspapers. Robin dresses in clothes that are not his. The sweater he is wearing is said to belong to one of Robin's daughters. It seems that several people had used it, but it is clear that it is not Robin's. He puts on David's gloves. He unlocks the rifle with the key and starts the massacre. The first one is Lynn. She is in the room closest to the entrance. He finds her in her bed and shoots her. She doesn't die, so he shoots again. He has to do it a third time. With Margaret, he is more effective. A single bullet does the job. Then it's Stephen's turn, who sleeps in a room connected to his mother's. Stephen is awake. He may have heard some noise. He faces his attacker, who shoots him, hits him with the rifle, and then stands over him. He pulls on his shirt until he suffocates him, and when he no longer offers resistance, he kills him. And at some point during this struggle, he removes his gloves because the weapon jammed. Then he goes down to the lower floor and finds Aroha kneeling on the ground. She begs him not to kill her. He misses the first shot. The second shot does not miss, hitting her in the forehead, and Aroha falls backwards. Once the entire family is dead, he changes clothes, leaves them in the laundry basket, goes up to the study, turns on the computer, writes the note for his son, and shoots himself. This point is interesting because it is shot with a rifle, which is a long weapon and more complex to use for suicide than a pistol. Additionally, since the bullet entered from the left, they deduce that he used that hand to shoot. But Robin is right-handed. Shooting oneself in the temple with a rifle is not the easiest way to commit suicide with a rifle, but it is possible. The problem is that the rifle does not have Robin's fingerprints. It does have David's and Stephen's. Robin did not have gunshot residue on his hands. They tested several hours later. The second option is that David is the killer and has tried to simulate his father's suicide. In this case, the theory is that he would have shot the family before going to deliver the newspaper. He would have put the bloody clothes in the laundry basket and, upon returning from his delivery, would have waited for Robin to enter the house. Robin lived in a caravan on the same plot as the house. Every morning, he entered the house, and the first thing he did was pray on his knees in the dining room. They believe David hid behind the curtains, and when his father entered the living room and knelt down, he shot him with the rifle at close range. Then he left the weapon next to his father and called emergency services. That's why Robin's body wasn't as cold as the rest. In the case that it was Robin who did it, there are elements that don't fit, such as why he put on gloves to shoot. Why his son's gloves? It has been proven that he wiped the rifle with a cloth or a towel, possibly to erase fingerprints. Why eliminate traces and then leave a note addressed to his son, assuming that you yourself have killed the rest? There are also many doubts about the note. They believe that if Robin had written it, he would have written "I'm sorry. You are the only one who deserves to live." Instead, it was written "I'm sorry, you are the only one who deserved to live." The mix of verb tenses seems strange for Robin, who was a teacher, and it also seems odd that he decided to turn on the computer, which takes time to start up. Additionally, it is a modern instrument for him, who was a lover of doing everything by hand. It seems that Robin has tried hard not to leave traces of his authorship because with everything they have, they cannot prove it was him. In the case that the author was David, there are elements that make much more sense. For example, the broken glasses. The frame is in David's room, but the missing lens is found in Stephen's room under some things that were moved during the struggle. The hypothesis is that during the fight, the glasses flew off David's face. Then he went to Aroha's room and shot, but since he couldn't see well without the glasses, he missed the first shot. Then he went to Stephen's room to pick up the glasses but didn't realize a lens was missing. In this hypothesis, David changes clothes and starts the washing machine before going to deliver the Otago Daily Times. Upon returning home, he turns on the computer to leave the fake suicide note and waits for his father behind the curtains. David, initially, was not a suspect. They did not test him for gunshot residue, but they did observe that he had marks on his face, scratches, and a bruise that he could not explain how he got. For days after the crime, they discovered David and accused him of murdering his entire family. The trial against David, who has been in jail all this time, begins in May 1995, 11 months after the crime. The nation is divided between those who believe David killed his family and those who believe it was Robin, and the trial generates a lot of expectation. David attends all the sessions dressed in striking wool sweaters knitted by his mother, Margaret. According to them, following David's designs, most have bright colors and extravagant patterns or designs. The police officers and ambulance personnel who went to the house on the day of the crime believe that David was faking his anxiety and attacks. The paramedic explains that the convulsions are the result of muscle contractions. Each muscle in the body contracts at a different moment and produces a different movement, so the convulsions are not orderly. The limbs do not move simultaneously. David had coordinated movements in his legs and arms, so they did not seem like real convulsions because he believes they are impossible to fake. The police officer who attended to him after his first fainting with convulsions also believes it was faked. Before the trial, David has flashes of his dead siblings. He is convinced that they are memories coming back to his mind, that he saw his siblings the day his father killed the entire family, and then he went into shock. He doesn't know for how long, but that would explain why it took him so long to call the police. When asked in court, he explains what those memories are like. He says that Lynn seemed to be alive, as she was making a gurgling sound. According to the prosecution, this is a detail that only the killer could know because the autopsy shows that Lynn first received 2 non-fatal gunshot wounds. It is possible that she was left unconscious and dying, but the prosecutor claims that David finished off Lynn after killing Aroha, returning to the upper floor and hearing the gurgling sound. Additionally, they found the rifle with David's fingerprints. The defense argues that these could have been from any other time. They didn't clean the rifle often, and even though the prints are on bloodstains, they could have been made during a hunting trip David went on weeks before the crime. In the trial, David's aunt, with whom he stayed after the crime, testifies. She recounts that David had several episodes where he spoke as if he were in a trance, saying words like black hands and all dead. At first, she thought David was a witness to the crimes and was still in shock, but she also considered that he might have committed them because, outside of those trance moments, David was very composed. So much so that he decided to organize his family's funeral and meticulously chose each person's clothing, different flowers for each family member, and the music. David did not want to delegate anything or let others make decisions. They try to prove that David was the killer by using the bloody footprints left on the carpet. The problem with this evidence is that they had little time to analyze it because the luminescence effect lasts briefly, and the measurements do not match either Robin's or David's foot size. These footprints cannot be attempted to be recovered again, nor can the carpet be tested in another way. Because the house, by order of the family's heirs, was burned down 2 weeks after the crime. On July 5, 1994. For the investigators, a determining element that allowed them to recreate the scene and decide that it was David is a bullet casing found behind the dining room curtains. In the computer room. They believe David hid there and shot his father when he was about to do his morning prayers. For the investigators, the fact that the killer used gloves and wrote the note on the computer indicates that he did not want to leave clues about who he was. In the case of Robin, it would not make sense to hide that he was the one who had shot because he left it written. David denies everything. He says that his bloody fingerprint on the washing machine must have been left when he picked up the clothes from the basket. He didn't realize he had blood, but the prosecution also presents as evidence the fact that David arrived home at 6:42, according to his own words, and the computer was turned on at 6:44. Because if it was his father who turned it on and wrote the note before committing suicide, that would have happened with David already at home. Therefore, it could only have been the son. The jury deliberates for 9 hours before announcing that they have made a decision. David Bain is found guilty of 5 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole before 16 years. David does not accept his sentence. He insists that he is innocent, and despite the fact that there is no evidence proving it was his father, and there is evidence that it was him, such as his fingerprints on the rifle or his bloody fingerprint on the washing machine, a support group is created for David that fights to have some of the evidence reviewed and to force an appeal. It all starts with a friend of Lynn who, despite having told the police that Lynn was being abused by her father, was not called to testify at the trial. This friend presents an affidavit in which he assures that Lynn, the last Friday before she was killed, told him that she was going to her parents' house over the weekend to explain the abuses by Robin. This, which was not known to the public or the jury, could be the motive that led Robin to kill his family. When Lynn's story becomes public, more witnesses come forward to say that she also told them. Therefore, the first appeal made by David Bain's defense is to argue that not all witnesses were heard and to question why Lynn's friend's statement was rejected. They achieve nothing with this first appeal. Joe Karam, a former professional rugby player who was a regular in the New Zealand national team known as the All Blacks, reads an article in the newspaper about the struggle of David's supporters to prove his innocence and becomes convinced that the boy is innocent. He offers his help and his money to prove Robin's guilt. One of the first things he does is hire a new team of lawyers for David, who investigate and manage to take the appeals to the highest level, the Privy Council, which is the Supreme Court. This New Zealand Supreme Court was located in the United Kingdom and presided over by the Queen. In 2004, the Supreme Court of New Zealand was established, and they stopped going to the Privy Council. The David Bain case is the last one discussed in this court that hears his case in 2007. David's defense, after years of investigation and analysis of the evidence, alleges that there were malpractices in the investigation of the case and that not all the information was presented at the trial, making his conviction a judicial error. 9 points are presented that demonstrate, according to the defense, that David is innocent and was not judged under fair conditions. 1. Robin's mental state. In the trial, he was presented as a balanced person, but there are numerous witnesses who speak of depression and marital problems. 2. The motivation. During the trial, the motivations of Robin to commit the crime were never exposed. It is logical because David was the one being judged, and they believe that the sexual abuses and the threat of making them public are the reason why Robin killed his entire family. 3. The bloody footprints. They protest that the footprints of the bloody sock, which were a few millimeters larger than David's foot, were accepted as valid, which according to the defense, does not prove that he was the perpetrator. On the contrary, they point to Robin, who had a larger foot. 4. The computer. In the trial, it was said that the computer was turned on at 6:44, which would point quite a bit to David, who arrived home a couple of minutes earlier. However, after the trial, experts say it could have been turned on at 6:39, which complicates the idea that David was the one who pressed the button. David said he arrived home at 6:42, but no one checked if his clock was accurate or if it was like the neighbors. According to this new version, the computer was turned on 3 minutes before David arrived home. 5. The time of arrival home. No effort was made to determine exactly when he arrived home. 6. The glasses. The hypothesis is that David was wearing them, and they broke during the attack on Stephen. But now his defense says that those glasses were not David's but his mother's. It seems they had a similar prescription, so they could have used them because David's glasses were broken and had been taken to the optician. 7. The lens of the glasses. David's defense argues that the lens found in Stephen's room could not have fallen during the murder because it was under several things. If they didn't even see it in the first inspection, how did it end up under there? The photos show the lens covered in dust, which for the defense is proof that it had been there for many days. The furniture was completely covered in dust. Therefore, moving around that house inevitably means stirring up a lot of dust that settles back down, so the lenses were immediately covered in dust and then covered with something that fell on them. 8. The rifle. The next point they discuss is the fingerprints found on the rifle. They consider them to be from the crime because they are imprinted on blood. But David's defense says it could be animal blood left there at an earlier time. There is no analysis to prove that the blood on the rifle was human or to rule it out. Let's remember that the investigation was conducted in 1994. Finally, point 9. Laniet's gurgling. Experts say that a dead body can also produce noises due to the air and gases remaining in the body that are expelled. So, it is not a mathematical rule that whoever heard the noises from Laniet's body was the killer. With all this, the highest court is convinced that David Bain did not have a fair trial and decides to overturn the conviction. They order a new trial in which all the evidence is considered, and emphasis is placed on these 9 points. David Bain is released on parole on May 15, 2007, after 13 years in prison. The second trial takes place in June 2009, 15 years after the crime. David Bain attends wearing a blazer and tie. However, the public attends wearing t-shirts printed like the sweaters that Margaret Bain knitted for her son and that became so popular during the first trial. The prosecution places great importance on the fact that, according to the autopsy, Robin Bain had not emptied his bladder before starting the massacre. They state that he was almost 60 years old and that it was quite full, that he must have felt the need to urinate, and they find it very strange that in a stressful situation he did not do so because stress increases the need to empty the bladder. David's defense also argues to place more blame on Robin, stating that Robin had marks on his hands from reloading the rifle. However, the prosecution argues that Robin worked with his hands to make repairs around the house and that the person who had marks typical of a fight was David. The marks on his face were visible, but there are also claims that when he was put in jail, he had marks on his torso. No one took photos, so we don't know if the marks existed, and if they did, it wouldn't be clear if they were a result of the fight with his brother. But everyone saw the marks on his face. There are even photos from those days, but after the family's murder, the firefighters, with permission from the police and the family, burned down the house. In this trial, there is no new evidence beyond what was seen in the first trial, which is now being reanalyzed: the bloody footprints, bloodstains throughout the house, a bullet behind the curtains, etc. But different perspectives are provided compared to the first time, such as the witnesses who talk about Robin's sexual assaults on his daughter or Laniet's alleged pregnancy while she was in Papua New Guinea, which her New Zealand family knew nothing about. And neither did David. Finally, in this second trial, on May 27, 2009, David Bain is declared innocent. The trial has not managed to convince everyone. Opinions remain divided, with some thinking that an innocent person has been declared guilty, while others believe that David was imprisoned for 13 years for something he did not do. After the trial, a new analysis of the call David made the day he found his parents dead is published. In the call, he could barely breathe and had to whisper some words because he was out of breath. There is a moment that lasts a second and generates controversy because, between gasps, it seems he says something. Some believe he says I cannot breathe. Others hear I shot the prick, but it is said between gasps and is barely understandable. The controversy did not end with the second trial. In 2012, a retired judge decided to analyze the case. I imagine it was as a hobby, and his conclusion was that the police had made many mistakes. For example, they never tested David's hands for gunshot residue and did not analyze the debris under Stephen's nails that could have indicated who his attacker was. Not to mention when they allowed the entire house to be burned down with all its contents just 2 weeks after the crime. David decides to sue the government for the judicial error and the years he spent in prison. Being innocent, what the state does after reading the conclusions of the 2012 study is to ask for a second opinion from another retired judge who contradicts the first and says that in the second trial, David's lack of guilt was not proven. Since the first trial, there was evidence against him, classic evidence like fingerprints. However, the state paid David Bain nearly 300,000 New Zealand dollars, about 170,000 euros, as a final settlement to his litigation. Bain's trial was the most expensive in history up to that point. The state, however, made it clear when paying that they considered it compensation for having David Bain unjustly imprisoned. Joe Karam, his defender, went bankrupt to pay for his defense, but later became an author telling this story and did very well. David Bain got married and is a father. He gives talks about what it is like to be unjustly imprisoned. He no longer uses his last name, but his wife's. Was David a victim? Or did he really kill his entire family?